Good day, folks. While you would have blinked, you may have missed the news yesterday. One of the ones I mentioned was opening up of international flights to Srinagar, and that too from the Middle East. So there are 2 points that we are suggesting to the world here, and Pakistan probably is getting a bad stomach and bad digestive problem. One is the fact that obviously this signifies that we are ready to open up Kashmir to the world. And second, more importantly, the flight that's coming in is from the Middle East, Muslim area. So the acknowledgement from their side too that the Kashmir is part of India. So that's the important part, right? The other one that you might miss, it came as a Bloomberg, center in talks with Taiwan over chip plant cut in tariffs. So this is basically a trade-off, I think, is that India probably is going to give an FTA to Taiwan. As a trade-off, Taiwan is going to set up a $7.5 billion fab plant in India. Important geostrategic messaging and move, and important because the rest of the world now has shown, the United States, Japan, Australia, that they are going to come to the defense of Taiwan. So that all those bogeys that were being floated around, that no, maybe not Afghanistan, have been put to rest, folks. And here is what I have to hear. The first, I think that the perfect geostrategic location and geographic location is probably Ladakh, because you can use solar power, you can use clear water, the climatic conditions are perfect. And second, the world will protect it, and Ladakh is the other airport now needs to be opened up, and it should be opened up to airlines from Japan and maybe the United States. But this is what you got to hear about what Tokyo thinks about the global view by Walter Russell Mead. What does he write? He writes, he says, but Tokyo's increasingly aggressive pushback against Chinese pressure on Taiwan is causing more heartburn in Beijing than lost Olympic glory. The headline moves are still about Taiwan. On July 9th, an editorial in these pages noted Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso's remarks that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could threaten Japan's survival, and that Tokyo would join Washington to defend the island in such a case. The next week, Japan's annual defense report broke with long-standing practice to highlight the importance of Taiwan to Japan. State Minister Yoshinde Nakayama, the second-ranking defense ministry official, told an audience at my home think tank Hudson Institute that the world needs to wake up to the threat of that China poses to Taiwan, and India will play an important role, folks, to defend. Many in Beijing seem to think that China's rise to preeminence is inevitable, and that their Asian neighbors will have to fall in line. Perhaps, but table tennis is not the only arena in which China's drive for dominance is encountering an unexpectedly effective Japanese response. And India should bear that in mind, because Japan is important to India. Then can Quad working groups lead to an Asian NATO? Maybe not. So there are 3 working groups, right? There's a vaccine group, then there is a group for climate, and then there's a group for critical and emerging technologies. He says Australia, Japan, India, and the US do quite a lot of bilateral and trilaterally. 3 of them are treaty allies. The 3 working groups, if taken seriously, can potentially set Quad on course to kind of formalization that some have said is its inescapable future, an Asian NATO. Well, it may not be there in so many words, but what's happened at the in-person meeting of the Quad in DC, the tune's been set. With what are we doing here? With big guns, Army keeps combat posture along LAC. After India's criticism, China says visa curbs apply to all. Spanking new M777 howitzers deployed with old Bofors. And what does China say? Some nations hyping China threat, says Beijing, right? And then we have this. For strategic reasons, India must deepen defense ties with the US. I totally agree, and it's happening though. 2, India has been traditionally reluctant to purchase US hardware due to the apprehension that Pakistan, which has a huge stockpile of American equipment, may be familiar with the weapons. So the concern that the enemy in the neighborhood may have intelligence on your weapons gives New Delhi pause, but not any longer, because the kind of equipment that's is being offered to India, Pakistan has no clue about. And the second, this plays in reverse. You're buying Russian equipment, but now China has dibs on all the Russian equipment. So it's checkmated there too. So if this is the logic India is using not to buy American equipment, it's the same logic it should be using not to buy Russian equipment. With the strategic goals of the world's 2 largest democracies more aligned than ever before, that should not be too difficult. With India hoping to meet most of its defense needs locally as part of the Prime Minister's Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, the US and its companies are ideally positioned to be the best partners and allies for India in the campaign. This is the time for the US and India to create a defining defense trade relationship for the 21st century. I totally agree. And this is a fact that you have to keep in account. And we should, as MS Rastogra wrote, as Casey Singh had reported, the United States must open up the avenue of leasing large platforms, whether it is fighter planes, whether it's transport planes, whether it's submarines, and whether it is aircraft carriers, folks. Cheers. More later. Okay, folks. So, I'm reading out some of the old stuff that started in March, right? Which is important to understand what the Quad doubts were and what the Quad will deliver and what it has delivered in Trump's. And here, got to hear this. So Manjari Chatterjee Miller writes, how much India should invest in the Indo-Pacific? She writes, while the US is explicit about the Indo-Pacific containing China and particularly the BRI, Japan and India have thus far eschewed declaring that it is centered on any other on any open confrontation with China. But I've already given you a piece of it, read out a piece of article that was written in Wall Street Journal after this article. So Japan has also jumped off the fence, and so has India at this. At some point, India will have to jump off the fence and land on a side, and there are indications that this may be happening. But hard choices lie ahead. This is particularly so because the idea of the Indo-Pacific is still evolving, and because President Biden has already made it a clear priority. India will need to decide whether it will be a founding architect as the US hopes, or a more passive bystander in what could be one of the key framing of international orders for decades to come. India has jumped, folks. So that's hallelujah, and that's good news. And what had Kaval Sibal written? 2+2 meeting sends message against muscle flexing. This is way before the president-elect. The Secretary of State Pompeo's visit to Sri Lanka, Maldives and Indonesia after New Delhi reinforces the message further. He writes, holding the Indo-US 2+2 dialogue just a week before the US president elections and when Chinese troops are amassed in Ladakh sends a strong diplomatic message to China. That this dialogue followed the Tokyo Quad dialogue, and inclusion of Australia in the Malabar exercise next month in the Indian Ocean tells China that its muscle flexing in the Indo-Pacific will not go unchallenged. Secretary of State Pompeo traveled to Lanka, Maldives and Indonesia after New Delhi reinforces that message further. Pompeo made no bones publicly in New Delhi about anti-China concerns contributing to the expanded India-US ties. China wants to dominate Asia as a springboard to challenging US global power. India is the only Asian country that can stand up to China even if there are disparities in power, as the current standoff in Ladakh shows. But curbing China's expansionism, which spans the whole of the Indo-Pacific from East Africa to the Pacific Islands, requires a more collective effort, which is why the Quad is important. Association of some ASEAN countries with it, like Indonesia and Vietnam, is the way forward, as is the participation of European powers like France and potentially Germany and the UK. And this is what is important here, is a recent is a statement made by the German ambassador in India. Government change in Germany consequential because they are anti-China. This is what's important. India increasingly important for Germany, says Envoy. Germany's focus on Indo-Pacific is not a military strategy, but part of effort to protect nations' interests, the ambassador said. And herein lies the collection that is coming together under China. I don't even think China expected such a blowback from its wolf warrior diplomacy. That's it, folks. So much to the consternation of China, the Quad is no longer a foam in the wide Pacific Ocean, but a reality. More than hype, summit shows that Quad is already coming of age. Written by Tanvi Madan. What's important is that she's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. What does she write? She writes, but the summit and deliverable signals that the countries today have a greater willingness and ability to act together. The deliverables include further concretization and enhancement of the COVID-19 vaccine initiative, the commencement of vaccine distribution, a pandemic preparedness exercise, a Quad STEM fellowship, Quad technology principles, a leader-level cybersecurity initiative, a green shipping network, a clean energy partnership, 5G deployment, and a semiconductor supply chain initiative, as well as new groups or task forces on space, climate, and infrastructure coordination. And you can already see that with the report I just told you about the semiconductor deal that is about to happen with Taiwan. Then from Modi visit, a message. The partnership is robust, Quad is here to stay, and there is clarity about the challenge. These are the three broad takeaways from the visit. 1. The India-US strategic relationship remains robust. The common threat of China has bound the two countries. 2. Quad is here to stay, from a virtual to an in-person summit in 6 months. 3. Democracy brings India and the US together, but is also somewhat contested space. What he writes is more important. Both Delhi and DC know that there is much bigger challenge, and clarity on the C word will prevail over debates on the D word. So China will prevail over democracy, folks. Yeah. So continuing on a very important outcome as written by Indrani Bagchi, 4+2- Quad Summit shows India matters in an emerging world order, but the AFPAC challenge remains. What she writes is the first in-person Quad Summit in Washington DC marked the start of 21st century foreign policy. India, the US, Japan and Australia took the high road to recognize that our shared futures will be written in the Indo-Pacific. Buried in the Quad joint statement, this acknowledgement effectively pivots the Quad towards the oceans, China, and a whole new set of challenges that will test these powers as never before, because what's at stake is a new world order with new standards and ways of cooperation. It is not the United Nations, but interlocking groups of converging and connecting countries. Okay. The 3 C's, COVID, critical technologies and climate, dominated proceedings. India announced the restart of its vaccine imports, and that's very critical. Much more important was the agreement on emerging and critical technologies, which should work to diversify from China and create alternative trusted networks. That again is very, very critical for India. On climate, India quietly signed on to a net zero by 2050 pledge, although with a rider on national circumstances. The AUKUS deal blows many non-proliferation sensitivities out of the water and opens a path for India that could lead to French sovereign Barracuda subs for the Indian Navy. AUKUS does not steal the Quad's thunder. It merely adds to China's challenges. It will allow India to focus much more in the Indian Ocean and Japan to the Chinese threats in its waters. When China looks up from the Evergrande crisis and Russia from its elections, they will have their hands full with Pakistan and Taliban. In a sense, so will India. This is the important part, folks. We've landed the trouble into not only Pakistan and Russia, but also China's laps. So not only economic troubles, this Wuhan crisis is also beginning to come back to bite and the origin come back to China. COVID origin. Now after Lancet doing a U-turn, COVID origin, WHO sets up crack team for a fresh probe. The pressure's on. Then you got an interesting read by Mohan Kumar. He says the emergence of a binary world order. He says the possible emergence of a binary world order deserves scrutiny. It must begin with a dispassionate assessment of the comprehensive national power of the two centers, US and China. In terms of military power, it is hard to deny the overwhelming superiority of the US vis-a-vis China. Thus, military expenditure, the US outstrips China by a factor of 3. It is true that in terms of boots, China has an edge, but then the US does not need to station troops on its borders the way China has to. And in terms of air power, the US has thrice as many aircraft as China. As for the Navy, it is true that China has larger numbers, but this is only for corvettes and frigates. In terms of destroyers and aircraft carriers, the US vastly outnumbers China. And in terms of submarines, there is a tie. In terms of nuclear arsenal, China has 350 and opposed to a whopping 6,500 for the US. It is economics that often encourage people to talk of China being a superpower and say that it is a matter of time before China overtakes the US in terms of GDP. This may well happen, though the time frame may well be a matter of conjecture. But even here, the tendency is to exaggerate the decline of the US and to overestimate the rise of China. Even if China's GDP exceeds that of the US, the per capita GDP is perhaps a better indication of real economic power. It is therefore not obvious that China will possess more usable economic clout than the US. In the area of soft power, China has a mountain to climb thanks to Wolf Warrior diplomacy, the opening of multiple fronts in the East China Sea, South China Sea, Ladakh and Taiwan Straits, not to mention the open confrontation with the US-China. China may have bitten off more than it can chew. Xi Jinping's domestic wars and his own authoritarian instincts have not won him many friends at home, let alone abroad. Then he says the European Union with continued to play the waiting game under the guise of strategic autonomy, but it is the ASEAN and South Korea that are the big holdouts in the complex game. Be that as it may, it is hard to see the EU, ASEAN and South Korea aligning themselves with China against the US. This then is the power dynamic that makes the impending binary world order fraught with tensions and instability, and India, folks, is on the right side. Jai Hind.